In the beginning, Rome did not look like the kind of empire that would one day drown in its own money. It started small, rugged, and hungry, just a cluster of villages on 7 hills, surrounded by enemies and driven by survival. The Romans were practical people. They believed in discipline, order, and careful control of everything, especially their currency. For centuries, Rome's entire strength grew out of a simple but powerful system: precious metal coins whose value came from their actual silver and gold content. A Roman denarius wasn't just a symbol of value, it was value. A soldier could hold it up to the sun and trust that the silver he saw was worth what the state claimed. This unwavering trust in Roman coinage built an economy that stretched across continents. Merchants from Africa, Britain, Syria, Gaul, Iberia, and beyond traded goods with confidence because Rome's money was famously reliable. A denarius minted under Augustus or Trajan could buy the same amount of grain, wine, or oil 50 years later. This financial stability helped Rome rise from a regional power to the most dominant empire the world had ever known. But the story of Rome is not only about rise, it is about a fall driven by arrogance, war, and a slow erosion of trust. And at the heart of that fall lies a deadly unseen enemy: inflation. It didn't begin dramatically. It started with small adjustments: a reduced silver content here, a slightly lighter coin there. Tiny decisions made behind closed doors, justified as temporary measures. But nothing is more permanent than a temporary solution in a desperate government. Rome's rulers believed they could outsmart economic reality. They believed that by changing the composition of the coin, they could create wealth out of thin air. What they actually created was the slow death of the Roman economy. To understand how inflation destroyed Rome, you have to return to one of the empire's biggest turning points, the 3rd century, a time of chaos that historians call the Crisis of the 3rd century. This was a period when Rome nearly collapsed, not from foreign invasion, but from internal decay. There were plagues, famine, military revolts, economic breakdowns, and emperors being assassinated faster than they could rule. During one stretch, Rome saw more than 25 emperors in just 50 years, many ruling for less than a year before being killed. Stability vanished, and so did financial discipline. Wars cost money. Armies demanded payment. Frontiers had to be guarded. Roads had to be maintained. Grain had to be bought and distributed to the population. Yet Rome's territory had stopped expanding, which meant its supply of new silver mines had dried up. The empire that once grew wealthy by conquering others now had to sustain its lifestyle through taxation, production, and efficiency, things the empire had never optimized, because conquest had always covered the weaknesses. As expenses soared and revenues declined, emperors faced a brutal choice: either cut spending or find new ways to supply the army. Cutting spending was impossible. The Roman army had become the backbone of the empire, the only thing keeping it from falling into chaos. But paying that army in full silver coins was becoming impossible. Rome did what many governments do in times of desperation. It manipulated the currency. The first major blow came when emperors began reducing the silver content in the denarius. A coin that once contained over 95% silver under Augustus slowly fell to 50%, then 30%, then 10%, and eventually nearly nothing. Some later coins had so little silver that people joked they contained a whisper of silver, just enough to trick the eye when polished fresh from the mint. But the public could not be fooled forever. As soon as people realized their coins were losing real value, prices began to rise. Merchants demanded more coins for the same goods. Soldiers complained that their pay was worth less every month. Farmers refused to sell crops at official prices. Everyone knew the currency was dying, even if the government insisted everything was fine. The inflation that followed was not a harmless increase in prices. It was an economic wildfire. It spread through every sector, every city, every farm. The cost of bread soared. Clothing that once cost 1 coin now cost 10, then 50, then hundreds. Trade slowed because no one trusted the money they were paid with. Small businesses collapsed because they couldn't buy supplies. Government-issued price controls failed, and anyone caught disobeying them was punished. But controlling prices doesn't create value. It only creates black markets. Rome's economy split into two worlds: an official economy that barely functioned and an underground economy where real value was measured in silver, gold, grain, or barter, not imperial coins. Yet inflation alone did not destroy Rome. What destroyed it was how inflation hollowed out the empire's foundations. The army became unstable, no longer loyal to the emperor, but loyal to whoever could pay the most. Soldiers demanded bonuses and payment in gold, real gold, not the diluted currency stamped with the emperor's face. Emperors who refused were overthrown. Emperors who agreed had to find ways to get gold quickly, often by raising taxes to unbearable levels. This drained wealth from ordinary citizens, pushing communities into deeper poverty. When taxes couldn't be paid, the government confiscated land, livestock, tools, and anything else of value. Many farmers were forced into debt or abandoned their land entirely. Agricultural output collapsed. Cities that were once prosperous centers of trade became ghostly shadows of their former selves. Shops closed. Markets emptied. Officials demanded taxes that people could not pay. The government responded by becoming more authoritarian, controlling wages, occupations, and even forcing people to remain in certain jobs for life. Merchants, craftsmen, and farmers were locked into their trades because Rome feared losing productivity. This marked the early beginnings of medieval serfdom. A free economy was dying, replaced by a desperate command economy built on fear rather than trust. As money lost value, people turned to alternatives. Barter flourished. Silver jewelry was melted into ingots to use in trade. Soldiers demanded payment in food, supplies, or land. Rome's monetary system began splitting into hyperinflated paper-like money for the poor and real precious metals for the elite. The gap between rich and poor widened dramatically. Wealthy families protected themselves from inflation by holding gold and property, while the poor watched their savings evaporate overnight. Across the empire, people adapted in surprising ways. Some communities created local currencies or trade systems that bypassed Rome's inflation completely. Others relied heavily on foreign gold coins, an embarrassing symbol of how far Rome had fallen. The empire that once set the global standard for money now saw its citizens prefer the money of barbarians. Even neighboring tribes began refusing Roman coins, demanding payment in bullion instead. Meanwhile, emperors kept searching for quick fixes, none of which addressed the root problem. They tried remixing the silver content again. They issued entirely new coins. They forced citizens to accept the currency under threat of punishment. They blamed merchants, hoarders, foreigners, and anyone but themselves. Every reform failed because the empire lacked what made the original Roman currency strong: trust, stability, and discipline. Then came the desperate reforms of Emperor Diocletian. He realized that Rome was collapsing, and he attempted to save it by reorganizing the government, splitting the empire into halves, tightening tax systems, and issuing new coins. But the most infamous decision he made was the Edict on Maximum Prices. a law that fixed the prices of thousands of goods, from wheat to clothing to labor wages. The penalty for violating prices was death. The idea was simple: force inflation to stop by freezing the economy in place. But economies don't obey laws. They obey supply and demand. Merchants stopped selling goods because they would lose money. Farmers hid their grain to avoid being forced into selling it cheaply. Black markets exploded. The edict collapsed in failure, and Diocletian eventually gave up the throne in frustration, one of the few Roman emperors to retire voluntarily. Despite his efforts, Rome's financial wounds were already fatal. The empire staggered forward, wounded and weakened. Inflation had not just destroyed the economy. It had weakened the army, fractured society, and undermined trust in government. When the Visigoths, Vandals, Huns, and other tribes invaded, they were not stepping into the Roman Empire of Julius Caesar or Trajan. They were stepping into a hollowed-out shell, a civilization whose internal decay had made it vulnerable. The currency that once unified millions now divided them. The system that once symbolized Rome's strength now represented its weakness. Inflation did not merely raise prices. It changed the psychology of the empire. Citizens who once believed Rome would last forever now feared its collapse. Soldiers who once pledged loyalty to the emperor now pledged loyalty to gold. Merchants who once trusted Roman coins now mistrusted every transaction. Inflation turned Rome inward, made it paranoid, authoritarian, and fragile. It poisoned every part of society until the empire could no longer function. By the time Rome fell in the West, its economy was unrecognizable. The silver denarius was gone. Currency had lost all meaning. Trade had regressed to primitive forms. Cities shrank. Roads decayed. Bureaucracy became corrupt and predatory. The empire that once controlled the known world had been destroyed not only by barbarians outside its borders, but by rulers who believed they could cheat the laws of value. The story of Rome's inflation is not just an ancient tale. It is a warning, a lesson carved into history, a reminder that every currency, no matter how powerful, depends on honesty, stability, and discipline. When those collapse, even the greatest empires fall. As Diocletian's new economic plan marched forward, the empire held its breath. His price edict had been nailed across markets, bathhouses, temples, and military barracks. Farmers studied the stone slabs with confusion. Merchants whispered to each other behind half-shut doors. Soldiers laughed in disbelief at the idea that bread, wine, oil, and linen would magically become cheaper just because Rome commanded it. But on the surface, for a brief, flickering moment, the empire looked stable. Coinage reforms brought cleaner silver coins into circulation. The government announced that inflation would finally come under control. And the average Roman citizen, exhausted from decades of crisis, desperately wanted to believe that Rome had regained control over its money. Yet beneath the surface, the truth was grim. Diocletian's new silver coins weren't backed by an honest system. They were backed by fear, command, and wishful thinking. The government still had enormous debts. The army still demanded more pay. The bureaucracy had become so large that tax collectors struggled to even count how many officials existed, let alone pay them. And in the shadows of the empire, a new kind of economic behavior started to grow. One that signaled the beginning of Rome's final, unavoidable collapse. Black markets. Every empire hit by inflation eventually develops one. And Rome's was massive. Merchants who were now forbidden from selling goods at market prices began selling secretly through networks of trusted buyers. Farmers hid grain. Bakers hid flour. Transporters lied on shipping manifests. Everyone knew the price edict was impossible to follow, so they stopped following it. The law became a joke, and the people who were supposed to enforce it became some of the biggest violators. As punishments grew more brutal, the economy simply slid deeper underground. Diocletian had tried to force the empire to obey his laws, but the laws only pushed people to stop playing by Rome's rules altogether. And that was the deadly turning point. When a government loses its monetary credibility, it slowly loses its authority as well. By the early 300s, the empire's money was already so debased that even Diocletian's new coins were considered unreliable. Prices no longer responded to reforms. Tax assessments became nightmares. Farmers paid in chickens, olive jars, and sacks of wheat because coins meant nothing. This was the empire that Constantine inherited. Constantine is often remembered for Christianizing the empire, unifying it, and giving Rome a second wind. But hidden beneath those achievements is a financial story that few people understand. Constantine's era was one of the most radical monetary transitions in world history. He saw the same truth that Diocletian had seen. The old Roman monetary system was dead. It could not be repaired. So Constantine did something extraordinary. Instead of reforming Rome's currency, he replaced it. Enter the solidus, a coin that would outlive the Roman Empire itself, perfectly weighted, nearly pure gold, minted with almost scientific precision. The solidus was not just a coin, it was a symbol of stability in a world where no one trusted anything. For the first time in 100 years, the Roman state issued a currency that actually gained respect instead of fear. But here's the hidden part of the story. Constantine didn't fix Rome's economy. He bypassed it. The solidus was so stable because Constantine made it for a very small group: the elite, the army, and the upper administration. The rest of the empire still lived off debased bronze and silver coins. Two completely different economies existed at the same time: a gold-based imperial economy at the top, and a poor, inflated, unreliable currency system at the bottom. The wealthy grew richer. The poor sank deeper into misery, and with every passing year, the gap widened. This dual monetary system created a quiet disaster. Farmers paid taxes in gold-equivalent values even though they earned income in cheap bronze coins. A farmer might sell grain for 300 devalued coins and still owe taxes equivalent to 3 gold solidi. The numbers never matched. Families lost farms. Whole villages depopulated. Landowners absorbed these abandoned lands into large estates, turning small farmers into semi-serfs. Rome was entering the stage where inflation does its most destructive work, not when prices rise, but when wealth collapses into the hands of the few. By the time Constantine died, gold solidi were the backbone of the empire, but they were also symbols of inequality. The economy now had almost no middle class. Soldiers, officials, and aristocrats operated in gold. Everyone else operated in worthless money. As the West declined, inflation became more than a problem. It became a weapon. Barbarian kingdoms watched Rome's money situation with fascination. Many realized that Rome's taxes and levies were increasingly collected in gold. While local populations were trapped in economies using cheap, regional coinage, economic pressure built silently in every province of the empire. The Western Empire began paying barbarian tribes in gold solidi to guard borders, fight wars, and protect trade routes. At first it seemed like a smart strategy: hire others to fight for you. But gold was scarce, soldiers were expensive, and Rome's internal tax base was shrinking. So the Western Empire turned to its final fatal mistake. It began melting down old gold coins and shaving their edges. The same cycle that destroyed the denarius now began to eat away at the solidus. Gold content declined by small percentages that Roman officials hoped no one would notice. But people notice. They always do. Merchants checked weights, goldsmiths whispered, soldiers demanded heavier pay, and the economy began to wobble again. By the mid-400s, the Western Empire's monetary credibility was dead. Rome wasn't building anymore. Roads were crumbling. Aqueducts were failing. Trade collapsed. The government had lost the ability to coordinate prices, wages, production, and supply, because no one trusted the money being used to coordinate anything. Inflation is not just a rise in prices. Inflation is the death of coordination. It is the death of trust, and Rome's entire imperial system relied on trust more than force. When the Visigoths marched into Rome in 410 CE, they didn't just take gold. They took whatever was left of the empire's economic soul. They walked through marketplaces where stalls were empty. They marched through neighborhoods where farms had been abandoned. They looked upon storehouses that held grain too expensive for ordinary people to buy. Rome had once been a city where coins clinked in every pocket, where currency symbolized power, mobility, opportunity, and freedom. But in its final days, money became meaningless. To the average Roman, the economy was not just failing, it was evaporating. Years later, when the Vandals plundered Rome, they discovered something shocking. Enormous private estates controlled by a few elite families holding mountains of gold while the city around them starved. Inflation always ends this way, not with rising prices, but with the concentration of wealth, the collapse of the middle class, and the destruction of the institutions that rely on a broad economic base. By the time the Western Empire officially fell in 476 CE, the Roman state could no longer pay soldiers, maintain public services, enforce taxes, or keep the economy alive. Inflation had not been the only cause, but it had been the silent engine accelerating every political and military failure. When the imperial banner came down for the last time, Rome's enemies didn't destroy the empire. Rome's money did. And yet, Rome left behind one final lesson, carved in history like a warning. When a society destroys the value of its own money, it destroys the foundation of everything built upon it. Every empire that followed would experience this pattern. The Byzantines, the Ottomans, the Chinese dynasties, the Weimar Republic, modern nations with hyperinflating currencies, all repeating the same cycle that Rome first made visible to the world. Inflation was not just an economic event, it was a structural collapse of trust. Rome's inflation did not merely damage the empire, it hollowed it out, until only the shell remained. And inside that shell, the last Roman citizens clutched worthless coins, reminders of a glory that once felt eternal. Rome didn't fall in a day. Its money fell first, and everything else followed.